All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I know we're 7 minutes after the hour. Welcome back. This is our second year doing trainings for OCFS. We're so excited to have all of you with us today. Today, we are going to be talking about SOGIE discussions for youth. And so this is talking through sexual orientation, gender identity and expression. We have some amazing speakers here to talk through with you. And so we know when working with youth, conversations around sexual orientation and gender identity expression come up very regularly. So today you're going to learn from experts in the field on how to navigate these conversations with young adults and youth under the age of 18. And so we're hoping today you'll leave with some best practices, resources, and concrete steps for affirming conversations around SOGIE. My name is Brittany Garner. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Point Source Youth. I'll be moderating our conversation today. Our first hour is going to be a Q&A with our experts. And then the last 30 minutes is going to be questions from you. So during our entire session, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we will be happy to ask our amazing experts your questions for the last 30 minutes. I'm going to let folks introduce themselves, and I will start off with Pixie.
Good morning, everyone. I am Pixie Popwell. I use they, them pronouns. I have my master's of social work, and I'm the project director of the California Homeless Youth Project. And I previously ran 3 housing programs for LGBT youth experiencing homelessness. And then Brandon, you may give it back to you, or I'll give it to Karen.
Thank you. My name is Karen King, and I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. I have a private practice, Total Life Counseling and Wellness Center, and I use she, her pronouns. And I have worked in agencies with youth in care and DJJ systems and homeless youth as well. So I'm really excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Where I serve the LGBT population as well. Did a lot of work around combating homelessness and program development there to start some initiatives within the umbrella organization. And I'm excited to be here as well. And should I pass it along to Maddox?
We're still waiting on Maddox to get into the webinar. We've had some technical issues this morning. But Sly, if you'd like to introduce yourself, you don't have to come on screen or anything, but just tell folks who you are.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Sly or Sly. I'm an associate director at Point Source Youth, and I'm just here supporting Brittany. I'm very excited to hear the conversation. Welcome, Karen, Pixie, and Daniqua.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Last year, we did do an LGBTQ 101. And so you can go and find the video for that on the Point Source website or with OCFS if you want just kind of a refresher. Today's going to be more of a 102, a deeper dive. And so Pixie, if you don't mind me having you start us off today, what does SOGIE mean? What is the important terminology for service providers to know around SOGIE? And what are some best practices around continued learning as language changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So SOGIE stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And really it's supposed to like encapture kind of that umbrella term, as a lot of times, you know, as identities are getting more labels and folks are kind of sitting with those. All right, the LGBTQIA plus, often, you know, there's letters being added before the plus. And so it is an intention to understand that like this is the group in which we're talking about, without making people feel like their identity is too much to add to the letter, and or that we don't leave anything out. Because, you know, often I've heard, right, that like, oh, the alphabet soup. And while there's also, I am not on TikTok, but I hear that like alphabet mafia is a thing. But basically like taking back the whole alphabet soup title, right? Like it can be kind of like eliminating, again, for a place for folks to have spotlight for their identity or a safe space, and then saying, well, that's too much. So really SOGIE is meant to encapsulate all of that. And what is important to know is that just like anything else, it doesn't necessarily capture everyone, right? Just like, there's been big movement with racial equity to have BIPOC, right? That also, a lot of folks don't necessarily feel like that encapsulates them, even if it is like supposed to be like good intention. So really, like, best practices really is just, you can just identify with where you are, and that can just be like, hey, I'm a safe space. I'm open to, holding that space for you, whatever it is. And even that being, you don't even have to tell me, like, just knowing that, like, being aware of how we're using language, whether that's, not gendering things or not assuming everybody has the opposite sex partner or dating or things like that. So really, just to start us off, that's kind of where that is.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And so Karen, our next question is for you. When and how should a provider start a conversation around SOGIE with youth?
I would just kind of piggyback off of what Pixie just said. I would really say just kind of waiting to see where the child is, if they're bringing it up, not to force the issue with them, not to come with assumptions, and to not read too much into what's happening and what's going on, because this is really a discovery age for them. So just kind of being that canvas, that blank slate for them to feel comfortable to come to you. Another thing was if you do engage in the conversation, make sure that it's a safe place. Make sure that there's not an audience or peers around, and really address the need of the individual. And as Pixie was saying earlier, like whatever preconceived notions you have about what you think someone of LGBTQ or whatever your biases are, lay them aside and really just connect with the individual, because it's not about what you think it's about what you can gather from the conversation. And so really being on their level, using terms that they understand, and being inquisitive. Like if you don't know, don't assume. Come in with, well, can you explain that to me or help me understand? Come in from a very compassionate and empathetic position. And I wanted to say this too, as far as like when, also you may have like doctor's appointments, you may have school things that are going on, or even placement issues. And you want to know these things because you don't want to put a youth that identifies as LGBTQ in an environment where they're not going to be safe. And so that is another area or instance where you would want to engage in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important to build rapport with young people, right? And know these things about them. So Ms. Cutno, what are some tools service providers can use to talk about pronouns, talk about SOGIE? What are the do's and don'ts for these kinds of conversations?
Ooh, I'm so glad you asked. Just to echo some of the things that Karen and Pixie shared about the appropriateness of the conversation and when to engage and how to engage. They both said something very interesting. When young people decide they're ready to share about their sexuality, about their gender, their expression, anything relating to their identity, keep in mind that gender is diverse. Language is diverse, our sexuality is incredibly diverse, and things are constantly changing and it's fluid. So while we may be familiar with the term now, it could be very likely that in the near future, that term is no longer acceptable. It's no longer a useful term, or it could be something that we used to feel was a derogatory term that is now socially acceptable. I think when a young person mentions a term to you and you're not familiar with it, feel free to ask, can you tell me more about that? I haven't heard that term before. Can you tell me what that means to you? And that, I think that just really creates a way for the young person to engage with you and share more about their understanding of their sexuality. I believe that either Pixie or Karen may have touched on this already, but just not assuming, right? You never want to assume the pronouns. You always introduce yourself. I'm Janiqua. I use she, her pronouns. What are your preferred pronouns? If you notice, if they give you a name that's different from their legal name on the document, incredibly inappropriate to say, no, what's your real name? So just being mindful of your language and the verbiage that you use so that you're careful not to offend or isolate or alienate a young person. Using things like person first language is incredibly important, and not using a person's identity as a noun. So you wouldn't say, she's a transgender, right? That's incredibly offensive. So what you can say is, she's a trans woman, or if you're unsure how that person identifies, then use something that is very neutral, and a trans person. I think also with, and that's just inclusive language, but sometimes it's important to reflect the language that the person uses. If you notice they're filling out documents maybe, or you have to ask some questions on like a questionnaire or something, be careful not to use language like, who's your mother? What's your mother's name or your father's name? You still want to use that inclusive language, your parent or your caregiver. What's the name of your spouse? What's the name of your partner? Things like that, that just take the gender specific part away from it, I think is incredibly useful. Some of the tools that I've used in the past that have just been really helpful in engaging folks in conversation, the genderbread person. And so it looks like a little gingerbread person. Sorry, y'all. But it breaks down sex and gender and attraction and orientation in a way that it makes it very plain and easy to understand. It's incredibly helpful with young people, but then adults as well. Couple websites that come to mind, the Safe Zone Project, tons of training there. It's pronounced metrosexual is also an incredibly helpful resource as well. So those are just tools that you can add to your toolbox to kind of keep you sharp. If that's helpful.
Awesome. Yeah. Pixie or Karen, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that if, even practicing something before you meet someone can be really well of just like using somebody's name, right? And in the place of, pronouns. And again, that's because until right, you have like the legal name or things like that. Or if you find yourself like not using someone's name because of privacy, then that's also an indicator to probably not use the pronoun thing either, is because it basically, unfortunately with our society, we connect pronouns to genitalia, right? So it's a privacy concern. So to really like think about that is helpful. Also, if you have met the youth and maybe they have like shared with you their pronouns or a gender identity or an orientation with you when you're talking to maybe a parent or a caregiver, or like I did wraparound care, so I was working with a whole bunch of different providers with that youth. They might not have come out to those providers, and so asking like, what are you comfortable with me sharing with others? Like, how can I, refer to you with us versus like if I'm referring to you otherwise, because we don't want to unintentionally out someone. And just often I'm seeing more and more, I am gender queer, I am intersex, I also am, queer. And so I fall under all of that. And I don't know everything, right? So even somebody in a community doesn't know anything. And I'll actually tell you a little bit about something that I learned a little bit later. But often I'm seeing more folks use multiple pronouns, right? Like they might say she, they, or they, she, or, all. And so the intention of that is do not default to the one that feels comfortable for you. If they're giving you more than one pronoun, use them both like equally. And it's a practice, right? We all had to go through trainings. We all had to go get some kind of certification or education. It didn't come easy to, as we did this. So this is the same thing. And so that's one, is that I'll see that it might default on the one that feels more comfortable.
Yes, definitely. I'm also in the queer community and I hear that a lot, right? It's like I use she, they, but like people are always using she. And it's like, yeah, I would love for you to use all of my pronouns. I think that's a really, really good point. Pixie, I'd love for you to go into more about a lot of the trainings we all go through, right? Like the frameworks of harm reduction, trauma-informed care, positive youth development. How does that intersect with SOGIE, and how might these conversations be different with youth of different ages? So how do we utilize these frameworks to talk to a young person about SOGIE that might be 16? And does that look different from a young person who is 21?
Yeah. Yeah, going back to, we get all these trainings, right? So I think really what intersects for all of those with me is the adultism that comes through, is this idea that, you know, youth don't know as much as we do because we've been here longer. And if we can relate that for a second to, have you ever gone into a job where you've got all of this enthusiasm, you have personal experience, you know, all of these things, but yet you're not seen as knowing as much because you haven't been at the agency as long, right? When really I just think burnout and, you know, just settling happens. But that's the same thing that happens with youth. And so honestly, I think all of these, you know, trainings or frameworks that we've gotten, if we look through the lens of the youth as the expert of their own experience, we can use any of it. So for instance, with harm reduction, right, the basis is that we want to make sure that they can make informed decisions and they understand the risk, right? So it isn't our decision to be like, you're not trans or you're not gay, right? That it's not, you know, we're not trying to make Florida everywhere. And so it's really in that moment of like, okay, so whether they know or not, regardless if they're 12 or, you know, 16 or 50, it is, okay, here is all of the information I know. Here is, you know, what do you know, right? Seeing, hey, Maddox is back. Seeing what, you know, what information they have and giving them more information and then asking them what they feel that they need, right? And that's, you know, that's the premise of harm reduction, is that non-judgmental with informed decision making. And then trauma-informed care, often, right, if they're having intersection or crossover with like the social service field, right, there is trauma there. And often it comes connected to, you know, those identities. And so really it is, okay, I understand that literally the brain neurobiology is different. And so how can I just make sure that I am being that safe space? One thing that I like to think about, and I don't know if it's ever been explained to folks like this, but it helped me because I'm a visual person, is that queer people especially, and when I say queer, I also mean just anybody under the SOGIE umbrella, is we walk around with armor, right? And you think of like misgendering, you know, like hearing like, you know, gay used in a bad term, all that, are arrows that hit like that, like old time iron armor, right? And it just makes dings. But then we as like providers are supposed to be creating this safe space. So often folks will take off that armor. If we misgender or say gay in a not a derogatory way, that same arrow is going to go through them. And so, right, that therapeutic harm. And so that's something that like I like to think about, is that it might just be like, oh, well, it happens all the time. Yes, but we have said we're a safe space. So that harm. And so I like to look at like trauma-informed care of like, not just like how we approach, but also what are we doing to almost be like, you know, avoid our harm. I think, yeah. And then, yeah, positive youth development is like, they don't need to have gone through child development or all of these things, or realize that they're still, you know, growing and learning, and their brain is still gathering all of the information to know that what they're experiencing is valid, and emphasizing where they're at, and also giving them power. Like we don't get to, like youth especially, don't get to control very much, right? Which is often why we see like, you know, what people label as behaviors come out in food, or say, you know, or not offensive, opposite, like not wanting to, right? Like, no, right? Because that's the only thing they can control. And so I think, you know, really sitting in that of like, hey, this identity is something that they can like support and share. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pixie. Is there any, like, we got a question about, many providers are interested in having these discussions with younger children. What are your recommendations to make those developmentally appropriate? Is there anything we need to consider for that?
Yeah. So one thing that's, I think, comes up that's quite interesting is like, we think that, again, it's when we're connecting gender identity, sexual orientation to like we're sexualizing it, right? Is that if we can remove that, then it doesn't feel as inappropriate, right? Of just like, hey, we're just explaining somebody about their body. Just like, maybe would have to talk to someone about like care. Maybe they've never been taught how to take care of their genitals, right? And like, again, I say that and it's probably like, oh God, thinking about that. But really, if we just take that away and we're not sexualizing it, it's all appropriate. Gender identity is developed by the age of 4, right? Whether folks have, again, it can be fluid, and there's language and situational, like the situationalness of how we're reacting to our environment, that it's developed at 4. So any conversation before that and after that is appropriate. Really, it is just about, you don't want to sexualize it in the sense of, well, oh, do you have a girlfriend? Do you have a boyfriend, right? Why do we want to know that? So really it's about, why do we want to know the information? And if it is about, again, that harm reduction, about, I just want to give them all of the information so that they can make the decision, then it's all appropriate. So really it's just about like, hey, you are allowed to feel connected, right? If you don't want to say like, love, sexually attracted, right? Just like you're allowed to want to feel connected to anyone. Do you find yourself leaning towards specific folks, right? If it's about gender identity, like really you can start that conversation through gender expression, right? Of just like, what do you feel comfortable wearing? What do you feel best in? And like also realizing that the answers that come out, how would you answer that, right? Because for me, when I'm feeling crappy, I'm going to look my best, right? Because I'm going to try to trick my brain. So that's important too, is like, do you feel safe at home? Right? Like if folks have that or not, or when you feel safest, what do you like to wear? Or what do you imagine yourself wearing? And so if you have the conversation away from feeling like whatever you say is now going to be imprinted on their identity, I think the conversation is open. I hope that that's helpful.
Yeah, I thought it was super powerful and important. Did anyone have anything to add before I move on?
I just wanted to throw something in really quickly just to drive home the point that Pixie made. The more conversations you have and the earlier you start the conversations, the more impactful and meaningful they can be and the less taboo. I think it's also incredibly helpful to just use terms the appropriate way, right? We've got this thing of nicknaming genitals and referring to them as something that they aren't, right? You don't want to call them a cute, funny name. You want to refer to a person's genitals exactly as what they are, and then use appropriate terms, right? So instead of, as Pixie was mentioning, is there a boy you like? Is there a girl you like? Is there someone that you're attracted to? And then having those conversations and breaking down what those attractions are, I think very early, and it's nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of times we just have to be mindful of our personal bias and our implicit bias and not forcing our opinions on young people, right? Because as Pixie mentioned, their identity starts very early. And so you don't want to generalize or stereotype or put folks in a box. And children are far more advanced than we give them credit for, and they understand pronouns. It's much easier having a conversation with a child around pronouns and sexuality, in my experience, than it has been with some adults. And so I think just having that openness and being mindful of your reaction, right? I think a lot of us in this field are trained to keep a poker face, especially when people share things with us that may be for shock value, or when we hear something that just may be a little bit surprising or alarming. We're trained to keep a very straight face. I think that just has to carry over when we're interacting with young people as well, and even children, of not reacting to something that they say, so we don't startle them, and so that we're continuing to normalize and validate what it is that they're sharing.
Awesome.
Can I just add two points here really quickly? Also just adding to be mindful of, I think a lot of times, at least in the past, when people had a conversation around like being LGBTQI, it started with like a little bit of shame, like, oh, like the world is going to be harsh on you and stuff, like, but being mindful of that language, and even further, being mindful of ageist language, because sometimes folks are like, oh, but if you wait till you're older, it's going to be harder. Like it just gets worse with time. Like just kind of being mindful that sometimes we think like that, those like entering the topic through that avenue, like that's supportive because we're thinking that's encouraging to be like, oh, do it now because when you're older it gets worse. But actually, like, no, it's not supportive. So just being mindful of in the past that those have been some of like the hooks that folks have used.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddox. And do you want to introduce yourself real quick? I know we had some technical difficulties.
Yes, thank y'all for your patience. It's been a very bad internet morning for me. My name is Maddox. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am a consultant in New York City, and then I do work around youth homelessness. And I'm excited to be speaking with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddox. Cool. And so our next thing is a lot of folks have asked for kind of an example or a case study. So is there a time that you've navigated a sexual orientation or gender identity conversation with a youth under the age of 18? What did that entail? What are some lessons learned from the experience that would be helpful for folks on the call to know? And Pixie, I'd love for you to start us off.
Yeah, so previously I was doing therapy for youth in the LGBT community here, just because it often under 18 isn't a group that folks often will support. And so the case that I have is for a 12-year-old, and they actually came in at 11, and their parents wanted a safe space, and also basically, I'll be honest, like a model of like, oh, hey, there's a non, cisgender person that's successful and, is willing to talk to you kind of thing. And that's kind of how it started. And the thing that was actually interesting is that, again, this youth had started presenting differently with their gender expression around the age of 5. And the parents were they were supportive, but like what wasn't taken into consideration was that again, intersectional identities where like this person was an introvert and their parents were both very much, and whole family was extroverts. And so that is something, right? Like, oh, hey, we're focusing on this LGBT thing, but you're forgetting all of the other components of this child, right? So basically like the family had, made them a suit for their father-child dance, right? And then it was in the paper and they talked all about it, right? And so and they thought that they were being supportive, which granted, like you're supporting this person's journey, but we're not supporting the whole youth. And so I worked with this youth for a year, doing weekly and sometimes bi-weekly sessions. And one thing I learned about LGBT Wiki, again, I'm in the community, forgot about things, that I didn't know some of those identities existed, like over like 400, and each one has a flag and a symbol, and they're all valid and supportive. But they're in a session, they actually were like, oh, I'm this. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Can you tell me more about that, right? And I'm a very transparent person. I believe in transparency and humility, right? And so actually giving them the space to teach me with knowing that it wasn't going to go out of the session. So actually what the session actually was, or our therapeutic relationship was actually providing, was a safe space for them to tell me what name they wanted to use, what pronoun they wanted to use, and what their like sexual orientation. And one thing that also isn't talked about often is sexual expression, right? So often we think, oh, well, you said that you are, gay, but I see you, like hooking up with, the opposite sex or whatever that is. And so one thing that's talked about too is like not necessarily, again, how they identify, but how that's being expressed. So that was a conversation that we had as well. And so in that, when the youth came was just like, oh yeah, I use my birth name. These pronouns are fine. Because even though there was all this room for support. And then through the year, actually with me, changed their name 3 times, used different pronouns, some I had never pronounced before. And so again, we practiced using those in sentences. I was like, oh, so I wonder how, whatever that is. And in that, they were able to settle in what they felt safe with. The one thing that is important though is for about 3 months, any information that they were sharing, obviously, right, it's private and confidential, but like that was only wanted to use with us. It was this safe space of like, okay, even though my parents know that I'm not cisgender and straight, I feel like they want me to decide, right? And it goes back to that, like, we need to be definitive, because I think sometimes the unknown is scary for everyone. And so we want to be supportive, but we need to know how to support. So we need to know the thing. And so for this youth, that actually created all of this anxiety, because they knew they weren't cisgender and straight, but they didn't know where that they were. And so with that, we only use those names and things like that. And so at the end of it, they came out on paper to their family, like still couldn't even express it. And then actually, like unfortunately, right before we transitioned out, that the family, even in their positive piece, wanted them like, okay, so this is now your name. We'll start the name change paperwork. We'll tell everyone, right? And again, that doesn't take into consideration the youth's anxiety, and also that they are an introvert. And so I think that that's a really big piece, was that the identities weren't the part that needed the support. The like internal anxiety and the introvertness navigating with an extrovert family were the things that were actually what needed support. So I think that that's the piece too, is it is good to know, it is good to be aware of your own biases, but also listening to what the youth needs and where they're at, because sometimes the LGBT identity is not the main piece. So there can be like trans folks that don't need therapy or services and might be referred because the parents are, or the caregiver or the teacher are the ones that are having the issue. So that's something that's really good to think about.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pixie. Does anyone have anything to add?
Sure. I would like to talk about the time, as I mentioned before, I managed intake for the group homes and independent living homes at my organization. And at the time, my organization has always been very forward thinking, always on the cutting edge of, service delivery and wanted to provide the best care. So we got a referral for a young person, 17 years old, in Mississippi, and in the area of Mississippi that they were in, it was not a very warm and welcoming environment for them, living in foster care and navigating that system. And the young person had a name that, if you used assumptions, you would assume that it was a preferred name and not their legal name, because it didn't align with what we assumed was their identity at birth. And the young person expressed their gender differently. So long hair, long nails, makeup, girl clothes. And so the case managers and probation officers and everyone working with the youth assumed that he was trans and he wanted to be placed in a home that is for girls. And I'm emphasizing the pronouns because once I had a conversation with the young person and once I interviewed him, he said, "No, I am a boy. I do not want to live with girls." And he was very, very adamant about that. He did not identify as a trans person at all. And it was, in fact, the service providers who had made that assumption and advocated for him to be placed in a home that was designated for girls. And although we wanted to be very supportive and we wanted to be on the cutting edge and say, hey, we're going to pioneer this here in Georgia, we're going to make sure that we accept this youth and place him in a home that's for girls, he's not identifying as a girl at all. He's not identifying as female. It's like, no, I'm a boy. And although he expressed his gender in a way that didn't align with his assigned sex at birth, right? That was his expression. So the point that I make with that, and the reason why I feel that's so important, is that we have to be careful not to assume things, and we have to give the young person a voice. And as service providers, sometimes we get directives from our leadership, and it's our responsibility to sometimes educate them and educate our colleagues and the folks around us, because no one had a conversation with the young person. No one had taken into consideration what he wanted, how he identified, and I don't think anyone had even navigated that conversation with him. And once I did the interview and we really just chopped it up, right? This is what we refer to it as, we kicked it. And I'm like, all right, so tell me about things. And he's like, yeah, well, I date boys, I date men, but I don't want to be placed in a girl home. And that carried with him. He transitioned from the group home to our independent living and never changed his identity. Still presented the same, still expressed himself the same, but did not change his identity. Never used she, her pronouns, never used they, them. And I think that's important because I think a lot of times, because as Pixie was saying, we want to be definitive and we want to put people in this box. And not everyone wants to be placed in a box. Not everyone wants to identify what we want to identify them with. And something else just came to mind with this, as Pixie mentioned, the young person that they dealt with was placed into therapy because there was some uncertainty with the family and with the service providers. Not everyone who identifies as a trans person has like a gender dysmorphia or, wants to, how do I say it? Not everyone has something that they need to address in therapy, right? People can choose to present and identify themselves however they see fit. And just keep in mind that sometimes those things do change. Because on the one hand, that was one person who was very adamant, no, he, him pronouns, that's that. And then I had another young person who was placed in a male home and began to identify as female. And the staff really struggled with respecting her pronouns and respecting the name that she wanted to use. And, she didn't want to use she, her. She wanted to use Z pronouns. And those are things that we have to wrap our minds around. And those are things that we have to educate ourselves about, and be ready and willing to meet the young person where they are when they decide this is what I'm ready to do. And with that young person, accept that they're going to vacillate. Or they can, right? There's always the potential for that because that's exactly what we saw with that young person. So some days she wanted to be her. Other days he wanted to be him. And as service providers, we have got to just roll with the punches. It doesn't matter if it makes you uncomfortable. It's not about you being comfortable here. It's about the young person. So we have to prioritize what makes them feel the most validated and the most comfortable. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that brought up a lot for me. I ran an LGBTQ shelter and drop-in for a while. And even in an LGBTQ shelter, you would have folks who would walk in and if you are experiencing housing instability, you might not be able to present your gender expression in the way that you would like. And people would assume when you came in for intake that the way you were presenting was your gender. And so I think you bring up a really good point of just never assume. It can be different each day. It can be different when they walk in for intake and when they go into housing, it can change. You have to be aligned with that young person and constantly checking in on that. Not in an invasive way, but just let them tell you where they're at, so that definitely brought up a lot for me. Cool. All right, I'm gonna move us on. Maddox, I would love for you to give us kind of a step-by-step guide to a SOGIE conversation. What does that look like for providers, caregivers, and for youth?
Yes. So for sure, it's quick and dirty guide, but just so folks kind of think about it as a bullet point, even if you wanted to talk about the, you came to this training and now you wanted to go to your staff and pass this information, do a little revamping. I always like to start off by identifying the bias. I know that, even though we might be in the field and we might be very forward thinking, it's just always important to talk about that, right? That we may carry our own inherent biases, especially when it comes to the LGBTQ community. So I just always like to start with, if I was to do a training on it more in depth, talking about the bias. Of course, I know folks probably talked about this before, maybe I was on here, but even for yourself and to give this information to young people, the acronyms, right? Get a little bit into the acronym soup and let people know, okay, start there and then get into the conversation that there's a huge distinction between gender and sexual orientation. Right? Because a lot of times people are like, oh, I think that's the same thing. What's the difference between gender and sexual orientation? Right? They're two different things. Think about gender more about how you want to express and present yourself or you feel, right? Because sometimes it doesn't have to be how you present yourself. Sometimes it could be you know, I feel very femme, but I dress very masculine, right? Physically, but you know what I mean? I identify very femme, right? So we can never judge. Versus sexual orientation, think what you like, right? I want to share, I always share this. I was gonna share this later on, but I'll just share it now. And folks haven't seen this resource, the gender unicorn or the gender person. I'll put it here. I don't know, maybe folks will be able to share it to the larger group of people, right? But what I love about this is that it's a visual that literally it has a unicorn or has a gender person, and it shows you like in their body where the different like, okay, like gender expression will maybe be more like in the head or the heart, or you know, sexual orientation will maybe be in the heart or like lower down somewhere, right? So that's very helpful just as a visual guide, especially for if you're thinking about folks under 18, if you're having this conversation with them, you know, it's a cute little cartoon and maybe it'll resonate more with them. It'll feel more friendly. It's not just all these big words. It's a little bit more friendly. And I think on our end, and especially if you're giving this training to staff, it's very important to talk a little bit about the stigma and understand the history of like marginalization towards the LGBT community, right? Like it's starting all the way from like even the fact that sexual orientation or being trans or being queer, right? That there was a point in our history where that was classified as a mental illness, right? So it's important to acknowledge that because a lot of the reason why people don't come out or people don't feel safe to come out, right, comes from this history. So for us to, as providers and as people who are working with LGBTQ youth, it's important to understand that and understand that this is the reason why some people just don't feel safe coming out, and when we understand that, we can be more supportive as to make folks feel more supportive. And definitely having a trauma-informed, I don't like trauma-informed. I like to actually use healing center engagement. Reason being why, if folks haven't spoken about it, and if they did, excuse me, and I'll just sound like a broken record, right? But trauma-informed moves us from the trauma, even in the language, right? Because when we say trauma-informed, trauma is still in the picture. And quite frankly, sometimes we're literally re-traumatizing young people when we bring that lens and we ask them to talk about their stories, right? Versus a healing centered engagement that's more centered in the healing. It's more acknowledging that you've gone through things and you've been through things, but there is a pathway, there is a way to healing, there is a brighter day, right? It's kind of like taking your experiences and flipping it to have a more positive outlook. So me personally, I prefer to use healing center engagement when I speak versus trauma informed. And because I'm a believer in manifesting, right? Like literally, even in the term, the trauma is still there. But when we use healing center, like we're taking away the trauma and it's now more focused, centered on the healing. And being that would lead to positive youth development, right? Because we're understanding, we're working, we're meeting folks where they're at. And we're also providing resources to folks to have that holistic conversation. And in order to have that conversation in a holistic manner, right? Like I said, we have to acknowledge the bias. We have to come informed, give people the information that they want, like know the difference, have the acronyms and the difference between gender, sexual orientation, for us to understand the history, the stigma, and use the healing center engagement approach to have these conversations. That's kind of like my quick and dirty guide. We will share resources that folks already haven't. That True Colors United has a learning lab that has a lot of great resources there for engaging with LGBTQ youth and youth collaboration. So I encourage folks to use that, use those things. But like I said, it's really about the more informed you are, the better, and trying not to be ageist or paternalistic, right? Where you have this conversation and not pushing it also, right? Because I think to the example before I started speaking, sometimes we think like for example, me, when I first started transitioning, I had a teacher tell me once, why aren't you dressing more masculine? Like you don't look masculine enough, right? Like, and sometimes we think that, again, like, sometimes folks think that they're coming for a good intention, right? It comes with that rhetoric of like, oh, but the world is going to treat you bad, so I have to make sure I train you for the world, and that's why I'm looking out for you. But really, as much as possible, trying to dismantle that way of thinking, because again, it is harmful for LGBTQ youth, especially trans youth, when you're trying to tell them how to dress because you think men or women is supposed to look like this, when it's like, well, that's the whole point, right? We're trying to do away with the concept of gender. So I'll be quiet for now.
Yes, I love all that, Maddox. I really love that reframing of trauma-informed care. I'm gonna internalize that for myself too in my work. Cool. So we have a lot of questions continuing on about working with youth under age 18. So I think a lot of folks on the call work with this age group. And I think there's maybe like a hesitancy around this conversation. I know we've touched on it a little bit, but Karen, are there special considerations that service providers need to make around talking about SOGIE with youth who are under the age of 18?
I would, it's specifically for the providers who are in the field face-to-face with these youth. And we've said it 1,000 times before, but dealing with your own biases. If the provider could have like some safe spaces for the workers to come and just kind of talk about what makes them uncomfortable, and then kind of process and work through what their biases are or what they're not understanding. You know, there's an adage that says, "In all you're getting, get an understanding." And so there's a lot of conflict that comes in these positions. Number one, because the caseworkers or the service providers are probably overworked, so they're coming in kind of drained. So really looking at doing some self-care, as well as doing the education piece, and then having the safe space for the team to get together and kind of discuss what's going on. I can say that I did work for the agency that Janiqua currently works for, and that was one thing that was really helpful for me. So I was in the community all the time. I mean, feet to the pavement, in homes, working with families face to face. And there were some cases that were really heavy for me. And it wasn't that I didn't want to provide that specialty or that level of care to be present with them, but it was that it was so much else going on around me. So if the providers, like I said, could provide that safe space for them to be able to come back and process and get those supports. I would also say having platforms like this, like if they could have more engagement with people who are face-to-face in the field as well, and sharing their stories and just gleaning from each other, because each one teaches one. Nobody knows all the answers. And so for me, education is huge, it's big. I would say one other thing would be actually getting some youth who have been successful in care to come back and talk to them about what worked for them and what did not work for them. I firmly believe that the only way for us to continue to grow and get better is to glean from the ones who've already gone through and who are successful. So the ones who've gone through care, you know, who've been in the programs, you know, who've been misunderstood, who found ways to overcome to get them on boards, to get them in meetings, to help plan policies and procedures and different things like that with engaging with the youth. I think all of that will be helpful.
Yeah, and I just want to add some things too here. And again, excuse me, folks mentioned this already, but I think also if or your organization, if you already have sort of a culture of LGBTQ, you know, like, for example, every young person you see, you talk about pronouns, you ask them their pronouns, right? Like, it's not like you're just asking for pronouns for people who you think or assuming are queer, but like that you have an overall culture of just generally asking everybody that comes in through your door, what's your pronouns, even if you are a non-LGBTQ shelter, right? Because even just that question itself can open up the doors, right? Because I've seen it, like, even for young people who are not LGBTQI, but they're like, or think that they're not, right? But they're like, oh, you know what? I can identify as they, them. Like, that gives me more possibility. Like, you know, I do kind of feel more than male sometimes. You know what I mean? So literally just having that question as a culture itself, because I've worked with people before who they're like, oh, if I don't see any queer people, why do I need to ask about pronoun? And I'm like, how do you know who's queer? Like, you can't assume that, you know what I mean? So you have to have that as a culture and a practice. And even if, you know, have little flags and stuff like that in your space, because that just makes it for young people coming through your door, like they seeing these visual things, they might already feel a little bit more comfortable, especially in the intake process, to talk about those things. And I would say, like, even going further, even offering, like, if you know about, or if you don't, I mean, I feel like you should probably update your stuff, right? But like offering like LGBTQ resources if you don't already have that, so that when when young people, every young person that comes, you offer it to them. If they're not interested and they don't have to take it, but again, this creates this culture that it feels like it's a culture thing. It doesn't feel like you're being singled out and you're like, oh, because it's like, why do you think I'm queer? You know what I mean? Like, I get good. Sometimes people feel like that. People don't want to be singled out. People don't want to feel like they're different or like there's something else. So as providers, as people who are working in the field, like we try to create that culture so that people don't feel singled out. So that's like, oh, we access to everybody. We don't just access to people. And I will also say, along with providing resources, it's really important that we talk to, to talk to youth, because unfortunately, sometimes with LGBTQ youth, what happens is when we fail to provide the resources or let people know about it, unfortunately, people turn to like other extreme matters to get what they need, right? Like I know young people who got into sex work to attain hormones and, things like that. And it's not safe. So I think about it, us as a sort of like a harm reduction prevention on our side, the more that we like push, in a sustainable, healthy way, like push these things out. And I wouldn't say push, but create the culture of it, the more that hopefully we can receive people and people don't feel like they have to do very extreme things to get the resources that they need.
Yes, 100%. Maddox, I wondered if you could expand on it a little bit. I know we're going to shift over to audience questions in just a second, but just from like a young person's perspective, what makes you feel affirmed, trusted, and supported in a program? And what would you like folks on the call today to take away from our conversation?
Yeah, I feel, for me, definitely what feels affirmed is when there's autonomy in the conversation, right? When there is like respect. And again, I think when it comes to resources, I always like to acknowledge that sometimes young people have institutional trauma, right? Or at least I did at some point, right? I felt like I couldn't trust these institutions. You got to think like some young people are, right, like stripped away from their homes, like ACS, something like that, put in these systems. And now these are the very systems that are helping them. So it's challenging to find trust there again. But when there is a space that is autonomous and is like, trying to be holistic, right, it's trying to meet you where you're at, that feels safer. And like I said, I know that this isn't too much about like being LGBTQ, but I will always throw this out there, that the more as providers, we creating like visual cues that LGBTQ, I'll focus my response particularly on LGBTQ identity. But right, like when we see the little flags, the little signs, right, pronouns, asking about, that makes you feel safer. That makes you feel like, oh, okay, like, people here have a little bit of context, right? Like I'm not just starting from square one. I don't have to feel closeted here. Like I could really feel open and I can feel affirmed, right? So again, I push and say that it's really about the culture you're creating. And it's also about meeting young people where you're at, like showing young people what are the resources available to them versus telling them, oh, well, you have to do this. So you have, what I mean? In order to be in care, you have to do this and that. So it's really about collaborating, meeting young people. And I love what Karen said about even if there's other young people who have like graduated from the space or like a little bit more alum, like also using those folks or collaborating with those folks to, again, like amplify the culture, make it bigger, right? Like now it's not just providers on the front lines, it's also other young people that have came to the space. So that again makes it more like believable for those young people, because I always like to say we have to always keep in mind about the young people who are traumatized by the system, who don't believe in the institutions, who are like, they have lost all faith, right? Like we have to, at least for me, like I always like to prioritize or everything I design, think about those young people, because to me, like that's the population that we most need to engage with. And also that it's not the easiest. And a lot of time people just dispose of that population, but we need to actually censor that population, because as I always like to say, if the most marginalized isn't safe, then none of us are safe, right? So we kind of start there, making sure that we're being inclusive of the most marginalized and working our way up that way, then I think that's a better chance of creating a system that's a little bit more robust. And I hope that, that people really take that away from this training, that it's about the culture we create and it's about being informed and being updated, right? I mean, the LGBTQ conversation from 10 years ago looks different now, right? So, stay updated with your trainings as well, and with your staff. And again, create the culture, create an LGBTQ culture, even if maybe you feel like, well, we don't serve LGBTQ. We probably have like 5 LGBTQ people out of 100. Oh, well, right? Like LGBTQ people are always in the margins. So how do we make it now that it's a culture and that it doesn't feel like folks are on the margin, that folks feel like they're also part of the center?
Yes, all of that. Cool. All right, so I'm going to move us over to, we got a lot of questions from our audience, which is exciting. So thanks, y'all, and feel free to continue to put them in. We got a lot of questions around data collection, and this can go to anyone on the panel. Are there any ways that we should be collecting data around SOGIE? And if so, what are the best practices in terms of confidentiality, discussing SOGIE with youth and families, and any kind of important policies that the agency should consider?
I can jump in really quickly on that. Obviously, we know that data collection is important for many reasons, right? We may have funding sources. We may want to be able to demonstrate the population that we serve. We know that about 1 in 5 youth have diverse SOGIE, and we want to be able to capture that and share that this is the population that we work with. And these are the specific services that we have geared to them. So there may be a number of reasons why that data collection is important. But I think before we begin that data collection process, really understanding why it's essential, how is the information going to be shared, to what end is it going to be shared? And then going back to that inclusive language piece, because that's incredibly important. If you're going to be collecting data, make sure that you're phrasing the questions in a way that it does not marginalize, it does not isolate, right? So again, back to those conversations of who is your spouse, who is your caregiver or your partner, using language like that. It could be helpful for, instead of just using like kind of binary male, female, or other. I think other just kind of tends to isolate people as well. So do an exhaustive list, as exhaustive as possible, as reflective as possible. Make it a drop down. Maybe on documents, you're doing select all that applies instead of select one or the other, things like that. Or you leave questions about gender and pronouns and sexuality. Leave it open-ended so that folks can write in the responses that identify most with them. I think little things like that just are incredibly helpful. Again, just being mindful of sharing information and to what end. As Pixie mentioned earlier, we never want to unintentionally out someone. I know that we have our staff meetings, and sometimes we work with our colleagues and we share information because we think it's really helpful to the work that we do. But really just taking a moment to assess the necessity, who's really kind of on a need to know there when it comes to sharing information in those sorts of spaces. Because even though a young person may trust us with some information, it may not be the same for a different service provider or for another colleague. They may not have that relationship. And if you've created a really safe space and a really trusting, warm, and welcoming space for that person, then I think it's important to maintain that boundary and give that young person space to identify with who they want information shared.
Consent, consent, consent.
Oh, yeah.
That is like, I mean, I don't know how many times I saw a young person get upset because you told someone else on staff. So it's not just consent with, their family or friends or other youth, but also like who you're sharing that with on staff is very important to clear that and get consent from young people before you're talking about any of this stuff. So I just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, and I just quickly add too, like, I mean, I always feel like, especially when it comes to data, it's so important to be transparent. And actually, like, young people want to know too, like, we want to, like, where is that data going? What is that data, like, is it helpful at all, right? Because sometimes data could be helpful, like, for funding research and purposes. So letting folks know so that some people don't feel like, well, why are you just taking more information on me? You're taking information on me every 6 months. But we're honest and transparent, like, oh, it's because of the funding. This is how we get resources. This is how we stay up and alive. Then people might feel more comfortable and open to that. And just because I'm a data nerd, like, just encouraging people to that, when it, especially like SOGIE, right? Like, maybe it's important, okay, especially if you're maybe like in a more rural place, to really like document, okay, how many LGBTQ youth are coming through your doors? How many, like, right? So that we, like, as a movement, also get that information and know that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say, just like add on a little bit about like the consent and transparency is like, because this, I feel like this also ties into about like breaking the ice with like during intake, was what also a question is like being transparent, but like being like humble and like a human. I think often we're told like as service providers or like, you know, anytime interacting, like there has to be this like professionality, but like we're told to remove our humanness. And I don't agree with none of that. And I totally understand being able to like, you know, make it about and for the folks that we are serving. But like you can literally say like, yo, I know this is really invasive. So do you want to just be like, pass? Do you want me to pass you the paper? Like give, you know, it's kind of like almost like that. You're like, we see often now like content warning, trigger warning, right? Like, can we give folks that when we're about to ask a question, like, or like, because it might not even be that it is a new answer for them or a new question, but like, maybe they've answered this 120 times and because it's a part of every intake ever. And just like acknowledging the ridiculousness of what we have to do. Because again, I think it's just like we get conditioned into like, this is what we have to do because this is what professionalism is. This is what social work is. This is what service provision is. And so we get used to it and oh, that's just what it is. And instead of like, again, removing that autonomy, just being like, being human of like, if I was the person sitting here, this is the third agency I've been to. And then they ask the question and it doesn't make a difference because I'm still being misgendered and I'm put in the wrong, you know, placement, right? Like being humble about it, like, hey, and if you don't know the answer, like if they ask like, or if you don't know the answer when you're saying that, right? Of just like, I don't know why this is being collected. Why are we collecting it? Or go find out, right? Or being able to say that like, I don't know why. And being curious about it is also really helpful. I just think in every step of the way, just being humble and human about like, I know this is redundant. I'm sorry that I have to ask these invasive questions before you even get to know me, right? I just think about how sterile the environment is in like just like healthcare, right? When you go get a new primary care physician and you have to be like, oh, how many people have you been sexually active with? How, you know, all of this invasiveness and how sterile that feels. This is so much more. And yet it's like that we're trying to create that sterileness and it shouldn't be there.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw that question about breaking the ice around SOGIE conversations and intake too. And something that I really never liked was someone just sitting in front of a computer and doing an intake and not being personable with the person. This is a human being in front of you. So if you need to print it out and put it on paper so that you can have a conversation. And also like, you don't need to go line by line, like just have a conversation. Like, hey, what brings you in today? Let's have a conversation. What's going on? And building rapport, and you're going to gather more from that than you're going to from the like very sterile line by line questions. And something else too is if you work in like a drop-in or somewhere where young people are coming in, there might be needs that need to be met before you're sitting down and having this conversation. Someone might want to take a shower or put on new clothes or have something to eat. And so if you're able to move your policies around to be able to like meet the person where they truly are at before you're diving into these kind of invasive questions, I think that's a super important piece of building rapport. And also like, you got to be cool with young people not telling you everything up front, and they are going to want to pass on some of those questions and they're not going to want to tell you, and that's okay. They don't have to, and they might later, you know? So yeah, I saw someone else come off mute though. Someone to add? No? Okay, cool. All right. We got several questions around struggles around caregivers who reject young people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Can you discuss more about the importance of being confidential and best practices to support youth through that difficult scenario?
I like to talk about this because this is an experience that I actually had being a young person that did, like, I was away from my family, and eventually, like, through my advocacy work, my family was able to find where I was, like what drop-in I was in. And for me, like, one thing that I really like was the levels of confidentiality that existed, right? That like for, even though it was my family, like folks couldn't tell them like, hey, this is where, like, I cannot confirm or deny, like this person is here. And also for me, like, it wasn't, I appreciated that it wasn't pushed onto me like, oh, but you should talk to your family. Like you should, like, it was very, my desires and my choice was respected at the time. And even further, like folks made themselves available to me where I was like, well, if my family wants to talk to me, then they, they need to be educated, right? So I asked the provider to share resources with my family on like how to be like affirming to their trans relative, right? Like how to make sure that they, you know, are reading, you know what I mean? Like you're not going to be like problematic when I see you again, right? Like training them so that they're not problematic. And it was just resource sharing. I know training sounds like, well, did they do a training? No, it wasn't a training. It was literally like, hey, can you send them these resources? This is the work I do. Like, can you just send them these resources? And I really appreciated that because I didn't have to talk to them till I wanted to. And I also got the opportunity to make sure that they were like educated and that they weren't going to be problematic because like folks were open enough to like do that resource sharing and have the conversations with them that I didn't want to have around like, well, this is why this person right now, this person doesn't want to talk and you need to respect it, right? Like, so for me, I always share that example because that was very like holistic for me, right? Like there was a lot of respect, there was a lot of autonomy there, and there was even a stretch, right? Because like they didn't have to share the resources. I asked that of them and they extended themselves, but they didn't have to. But I share that because as some best practices around it, right? Like meeting the young people where they're at. And also like if a young person asks you, hey, can you do this for me? Like being open to do that. Because you know, of course you could already know like all of the like how much anxiety inducing that must, you know, that is for a young person when like they're not with their family and now they figure out their family's reaching out for them and they might not be ready to reconsolidate again yet. And being mindful that I know sometimes people like to push that agenda, but I think when it comes to especially LGBTQ youth, like really respecting when that young person feels ready to take that step and not like trying to push that too much.
Anyone want to add?
I think, yeah, like I think being resource focused, because then also like looking at, we have all of these maybe policies for like the youth that we're serving, like, oh, they need to do this, or we need to provide all these things. And then not necessarily for providers, caregivers, things like that, is what is the policy on just like blanket like education and resources for like the support folks, right? Because often like people are interacting with our services because they didn't have those like, right, there's some kind of like consequence of like them not having the resources or needs that they had. And so how can we provide that now? Again, removing like shame and judgment is like often, right, they didn't have the education support, and so now that all these biases are there for them. And so like, do you have mandates for like parents or families to go through it, like get trauma informed information, or do you provide any other kind, and can this just be added onto it for a baseline, right, of like, again, not just for the families of or like support folks for those that are in the SOGIE umbrella, but like just baseline, like, because this is good information for everyone to have, and it could even be good information for them to have for, oh, maybe, oh, you know, because there's a lot of internalized crap. So I think it just being resource forward, because then it's not like, oh, I'm doing this in response to, just like, this is our general practice that we want you to have all of the resources you can, so that you know you can feel equipped. That's, I think, yeah, just being resource forward, and instead of, it's that whole proactive versus reactive piece.
Yes, proactive instead of reactive, definitely. Pixie, we had a question specifically for you. You mentioned that there are terms that you were not familiar with. Can you review some of the newer terms that we may not be familiar with as well?
Oh, dang, I'm being called out. It's about that, as you asked that. I do not have that on my brain. Basically, they were terms around sexual orientation. And so, and I can't give you the names right now. And I'm also an introvert, even though it might not come across like that. So I'm like, oh God, you don't have the answer. But it's basically like, now that there are more terms for gender identity, there are now more terms for sexual orientation that gets more specific to, it might come to me in a minute. that get more specific to who somebody feels that they are attracted to. So I don't know the term itself, but like, for instance, this youth identified as non-binary, and we're attracted to other non-binary folks and female identified people. So basically it was just like not boys, right? And so that's inclusive of like not trans boys, not cis boys, no boys. And then there's some that's like, I'm non-binary and I'm attracted to other non-binary people, right? So again, I think what happens too with academia and even like certification processes is that we're told that we have to like study for these acronyms, for these terms, and we need to have them in our brain. At the end, like, there is no way that you can keep up. I could literally fill like a PowerPoint slide with just terms that are just identities, not even about like anything else. And so I guess the idea is not necessarily remember the term, but just like what does it mean for the youth and how does it mean for you to show up? Because like at the end of the day, it's not like for me, right? Like therapy, they're not going to bring their person in. We're not going to be dating. So the information doesn't it doesn't really apply to me, but really it's just like, okay, how do I know then, how does this change my language or interaction? Does it? And what do they need from that information? So yeah, that literally I've been putting links in the chat just based on our conversation. And that's just how I am. I'm like, oh, here, that's a good resource for that conversation. Here's another one. So there's some throughout the chat, but I'll put the LGBT wiki, and I know everybody has their own feelings about Wikipedia, but again, we've been talking about consent and autonomy, and literally Wikipedia is that, right? It's the autonomy to give yourself your own bubble and then people join in. And so the LGBT wiki specifically is ones that like, hey, this is me, does this have a term? And people are like, nah, but that's me too. And then a brain, like a flag is made and all this. And so I'll put that link in there. And is it okay? I see if somebody just put in about like poly relationships. Is that okay? So I actually identify as a poly person, non-monogamous. And I think that that's also what I was kind of leaning to also with sexual expression, right? Is that not only about what is our orientation, but how are we showing it? And so with with non-monogamy, that like folks like, again, you can be straight and be polyamorous. So again, that's why there's this separation. And so too, yeah, like, is there in your intake, in your paperwork for the youth or for support people, how many spaces do you have for like parents or for caregivers or things like that, and not assuming that it is just one. I tri-parented, I guess it would be, so there were 3 of us and all of us had like legal, like either biological or legal bounds, and so what was that was complicated for folks, definitely. Yeah, and if any more questions come up around that, but yeah, just again looking at, there is more than we're ever going to know. So how can we just approach with that like 2-year-old curiosity about like, why? Can you tell me more? Right? Like, just be curious and be happy to learn more.
Yeah, I love that the person that asked the conversation, right? Because like, I mean, I think even for me, like I'm reflecting now and I'm like, you know what, even for my own LGBT, I have the 2.0 now, right? Because I think we actually don't give, in my opinion, like enough emphasis to the relationship part, which is like, you know, it's great. I think we're no longer living in a world where there's only monogamy, and like there is more conversation around there. And like, even for young people, like we should provide those options, because we know that a lot of young people, especially them, because like, you know, they're coming up in the times, like there are more polyamorous relationships. And it makes me think about even like when you go to the doctor and they're like, oh, who is your partner, right? But it's like, what if you have 2 partners and that's just, you know what I mean? Like you're in trouble or something, right? So, you know, I think it is important even for us to leave like here kind of thinking that food for thought. And I just wanted to add to your first part of the question around like, what are some pronouns? One pronoun that I heard that I was like, okay, like had to do some learning around is the it's like they, them, but without the TH, right? So like AM, air, right? So example, it'll be like, instead of saying they are going over there, it's like air going over there. Or like pass it to M, or use the air, right? I'll put the pronouns in the chat, But just so people can know, like, you know, language is always expanding, is always changing, but this is one that's more like central, right? With like they, them is something that else that's coming up that might take us some more learning to do, but I offer that as a resource.
Yes, I love all that. Language is expansive, gender is expansive, sexuality is expansive. And Pixie, I love what you said about just having that 2-year-old curiosity to it, right? Like why and how and cool and tell me more. I think that's just like a great way to approach any conversations with young people around SOGIE or otherwise. So I love all of that. We only have about 7 minutes left. So I would love for all of our amazing panelists to thank you again for being here. It was amazing. But I would love for you to just kind of like leave us with some final thoughts, you know, like things about how we affirm SOGIE practices and all of our interactions, how to create like a sex positive environment, how do we create this expansive, curious environment for youth of all ages.
I can kick it off just because I forgot to mention this really important point, especially when it comes to your sexual education conversations, making sure that you are inclusive of LGBTQ identity, right? Because when I was in the LGBTQ drop-in and we had some sexual educators come in and they were just talking, you know, excuse my language for people sensitive ears, right? They were just like, oh, penis and vagina, right? And like, we know that people are having sex in other ways. So making sure that, you know, right, like with your sexual education curriculum, that you are updating it and that you're also including examples of people who are not, you know, a cis hetero woman and a cis hetero man, that you're also including like other identities in your examples as well. And again, like, you know, LGBTQ culture, make sure that you have your bathroom, that you have a nice visible, right, a bathroom, all gender bathroom that's not like, oh, you got to go around the corner, down the hallway, downstairs. It's like in the basement, right? Like it's near the other bathrooms too. Update your sex curriculum, your sexual education curriculums. Make sure you have a nice inclusive a bathroom somewhere visible, some visible signs, and create that LGBTQ culture in your organization.
I like to jump in really quickly and just to echo, as Maddox mentioned, making sure that your environment is just as warm and welcoming as possible, and being as inclusive as possible. But I think a lot of times those are things that if the organizations that we work with and our leadership aren't as aware or as informed, I think it's our job, it's our responsibility, morally, ethically, you know what I mean, to educate those around us and above us and be an advocate and, you know, feel empowered enough and empower the folks around you. If you see something that needs to be addressed or needs changing, then do something about it. You know, while my organization was as forward thinking and on the cutting edge as I thought it could be, I noticed that we didn't have appropriate training in place for service providers, for everyone in the agency who work with this population, to educate them on this exact subject, educate them on awareness and sensitivity and, you know, trauma-informed care around the subject. And so, you know, I, working with a couple other folks at the organization, found some training resources and implemented the training for the folks that opportunities like that, where you can be a voice for the voiceless. Even though, you know, we want to empower the folks that we serve as well, giving them opportunities, identify opportunities like that for yourself where you can make a change, putting literature, putting posters around that are diverse and that use with my connection. Okay, I'm good, sorry. But making sure that, you know, the public education information that we have around the office is diverse and it's inclusive. You know, if you have posters, right, you don't want reflect
I think we're losing you.
Nuclear family with what we see the mother and the father be able to, oh no, I'm sorry. I will finish.
We'll come back to you if we have some time. Karen or Pixie, would you like to include anything, some final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll go next. Oh, you sure, Pixie? Okay. So what I was going to say is that just piggybacking off of Janiqua and Maddox, like culture is everything. The inclusivity, not exclusivity, like letting people know that they belong. As Maddox said, putting the literature on the walls. I would even say sending out reminder emails to staff of different, someone doing research to find out what the new pronouns are. Just keeping the conversation of education and continuing to learn about the fluidity and the flexibility and the expansion of this, because as Pixie said earlier, like there is no stop on this. Like we're ever evolving, we're ever changing. And so our organizations, our workers, like we need to be right in the on the edge where everything is being pushed with doing the learning and coaching each other and helping out. So education is key, y'all. Just keep it going because it doesn't stop.
Yeah, and I just wanted to like one of the things that Janiqua said like reminded me is that like this I hear often about like giving power to the voiceless, and like this isn't like a job, it was just like a often no one is voiceless. It is we just don't give them the platform to use their voice. And so like also like emphasizing what Maddox had said is like how much room are you giving youth voice? Like are you asking them what they need? Are you giving do you have a youth board? If not, why not? Because again, they're the experts of their experience. And like also if you're going to do that, make sure you compensate youth, because you know we get paid for our time. But also like, do you have room for peer workers? Because like there is, you know, even, you know, I have lived experience of homelessness, like part of the community. And there are times that our languages or our experiences do not align. Like there was a youth that didn't, again, like Disney has their own thing, but like didn't know the end of Beauty and the Beast, right? Like, and I was just trying to use some kind of analogy, right? And so there are disconnects. So having peer workers or peer voice or youth around like can help with that often and increase comfortability in conversation. And also with that idea of experts of their own experience is like, do we need to institutionalize everything, right? Just again, we are not the experts just because we have letters after our name, because we've taken a training, we have a piece of paper that's from a dead tree. Like really like, how can we emphasize that we don't know everything and we're just here to help? Because I know for me, that's why I'm here in the first place. I just want to help. And so sometimes though, like going through a process might change or pivot our perspective on why we started.
Yes, amazing. Perfect way. You took everything right out of my mouth, Pixie. Yes, like pay youth, have them work where you work, let them lead. I would be remiss to also, you know, intersectionality is really important. So not just LGBTQ identities, but also making sure your policies and procedures are anti-racist and youth-led. Really important to the culture of your organization as well. It is 12:30 right on the dot. I'm really proud of us for not going over. Thank you all so much for attending. We will have a video of this going out as well as a very extensive toolkit. And so we'll have those for you in the coming weeks. Thank you so much again to our incredible panelists, and thank you all for joining us today. And we will see you in a few months for our second training.